Dear viewers, welcome to Deep Sight. In our previous episode, we discussed Napoleon's zenith, the moment he thwarted multiple sieges by the anti-French coalitions, marking the absolute pinnacle of his career. Yet, the trajectory from supreme power to decline seems to be the ultimate fate of countless historical figures. Would the anti-French coalitions, which had never been completely eradicated, rise once again to unleash a new tidal wave of opposition? Today, we turn our attention to the decline of Napoleon and the ultimate hegemony of France during his era, from the quagmire of the Iberian Peninsula to the catastrophic invasion of Russia. Following the signing of the Treaty of Tilsit, Napoleon's hegemony appeared impregnable. Yet, the seeds of its decline had already begun to take root in the shadows. The war in Spain would prove to be the very inception of this decline. In 1807, under the pretext of protecting the Spanish royal family, Napoleon dispatched French troops into the Iberian Peninsula. His objective was to bring both Spain and Portugal into the French Empire's sphere of influence, thereby further solidifying the continental system, while simultaneously seizing control of the peninsula's strategic resources to lay the groundwork for future expansion. Initially, the French campaign proceeded smoothly. They swiftly captured Lisbon and Madrid, toppled the Spanish Bourbon dynasty, and installed Napoleon's own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, upon the Spanish throne, seemingly securing effortless control over the entire Iberian Peninsula. However, Napoleon had gravely underestimated the Spanish people's will to resist. Joseph Bonaparte's puppet regime met with fierce opposition from every stratum of Spanish society. From the nobility to the commoners, and from the cities to the countryside, people rose up en masse, taking up arms to form guerrilla units and wage a campaign of irregular warfare against the French. Intimately familiar with the terrain and highly mobile, these guerrilla forces eschewed direct pitched battles against the French army. Instead, they launched ceaseless attacks on French supply lines, strongholds, and patrols, systematically draining the French of both manpower and financial resources. Although the French troops were well-equipped and highly disciplined, they found themselves constantly harried and exhausted by the unfamiliar terrain and the relentless guerrilla warfare. Unable to locate and engage the main body of the guerrilla forces, they instead suffered continuous attacks, resulting in a steady rise in casualties and desertions. Even more critically, Britain seized the opportunity to dispatch an expeditionary force to the Iberian Peninsula. Operating in coordination with Spanish guerrilla fighters, they dealt a heavy blow to the French forces. In 1808, the Duke of Wellington led British troops to victory over the French at the Battle of Waterloo, compelling a French withdrawal. In 1812, a combined British, Spanish, and Portuguese force once again dealt a crushing blow to the French at the Battle of Salamanca, recapturing Madrid and leaving Joseph Bonaparte's puppet regime teetering on the brink of collapse. The war in the Iberian Peninsula had become a complete quagmire. Although the French successively committed hundreds of thousands of troops, they proved utterly unable to fully conquer the territory. Instead, their forces became firmly bogged down and heavily depleted, causing the national power of the French Empire to begin its decline. Napoleon was compelled to divert troops from other theaters of war to reinforce the Iberian front, thereby creating critical vulnerabilities in his defenses elsewhere. If the Iberian quagmire marked the beginning of the decline of Napoleon's hegemony, then the invasion of Russia in 1812 delivered the fatal blow to his dominance. As tensions within the Franco-Russian alliance escalated, Russia grew increasingly resentful of French hegemonic pressure, secretly undermining the continental system. The Russians resumed clandestine trade with Britain, a defiance that left Napoleon absolutely furious. Concurrently, Napoleon's hegemonic ambitions continued to swell. Convinced that only by decisively defeating Russia could he truly unify the European continent and consolidate his own supremacy, he resolved to launch an invasion to utterly dismantle Russia's capacity for resistance. In June 1812, Napoleon assembled a colossal army, totaling over 600,000 troops and dubbed the Grande Armée, and launched a three-pronged offensive against Russia. Initially, the French forces advanced smoothly, rapidly breaching Russia's border defenses and pushing deep into the Russian heartland. The Russian commander-in-chief, Barclay de Tolly, adopted a strategy of avoiding direct confrontation and luring the enemy deeper into the interior. He led the Russian army in a continuous eastward retreat, ceding vast territories while simultaneously burning villages, crops, and supplies along the route. Implementing a scorched earth policy, to deny the French any provisions. Napoleon, eager to force a decisive battle with the main Russian army, led his troops in relentless pursuit. However, he consistently failed to pin down the main Russian force. Instead, due to an overextended supply line and logistical difficulties, his soldiers suffered from shortages of food and clothing, causing their combat effectiveness to steadily decline. In September, the French army finally reached Moscow, only to discover that the city had long since been abandoned by the Russians. Simultaneously, massive fires erupted within Moscow, consuming vast quantities of buildings and supplies. Unable to secure any provisions, the French forces found themselves trapped in a desperate predicament. Napoleon remained in Moscow for over a month, hoping to await a Russian offer of peace, but received no response. Meanwhile, the harsh Russian winter quietly descended. Temperatures plummeted to tens of degrees below zero. As most of the French soldiers hailed from Western Europe and were ill-equipped with adequate winter clothing or food, large numbers succumbed to frostbite and starvation. Their troops' strength dwindled drastically, and their combat capability collapsed completely. In October, realizing the impossibility of remaining in Moscow any longer, Napoleon was forced to order a withdrawal. The Russian army seized this opportunity to launch a counterattack, ceaselessly harassing the retreating French forces, while guerrilla units also joined the pursuit. The French army disintegrated into a chaotic rout, suffering catastrophic casualties. The entire route of their retreat was strewn with the corpses of soldiers and abandoned weaponry. By December, when Napoleon led the remnants of his army back to the French border, his Grand Army, originally numbering 600,000 men, had been reduced to fewer than 30,000. It had been all but annihilated. This disastrous defeat in the invasion of Russia utterly shattered the military might of the French Empire and shook the very foundations of Napoleon's hegemony. Witnessing Napoleon's newfound vulnerability, the nations of Europe seized the moment to break free from French domination and reforge the anti-French coalition. Napoleon's ultimate downfall, the 6th and 7th coalitions, and the Battle of Waterloo. Following the disastrous defeat of the invasion of Russia, Napoleon's hegemonic status hung precariously in the balance. Seizing this opportunity, various European nations rose up in unison to form the 6th coalition against France. In 1813, Russia, Prussia, Austria, Great Britain, and other powers formally allied themselves. Amassing their forces, they launched an offensive against France. The coalition's combined strength exceeded 800,000 troops. The French army, however, decimated by the catastrophic Russian campaign, suffered from severe manpower shortages. Forced to hastily conscript raw recruits, their combat effectiveness was drastically compromised. In October 1813, French forces clashed with the coalition army in a decisive battle at Leipzig. Dubbed the Battle of Nations, this engagement saw more than 1.5 million troops committed by both sides, resulting in exceptionally brutal fighting. Relying on his extraordinary military genius, Napoleon repeatedly repelled the coalition's assaults. However, plagued by insufficient manpower and logistical difficulties, while the coalition received a ceaseless stream of reinforcements, the French army was ultimately defeated and forced to retreat. The crushing defeat at Leipzig signaled the complete destabilization of Napoleon's hegemony. The vassal states of the French Empire seized the moment to declare their independence, breaking free from French control. In 1814, pressing their advantage, the coalition forces invaded French soil and advanced directly upon Paris. Napoleon led the French army in a tenacious resistance, launching numerous counterattacks in a desperate bid to turn the tide of the war. Yet, by this point, the French military had been so thoroughly depleted that the situation was beyond redemption. On March 31st, the coalition forces entered Paris, and Napoleon's rule collapsed completely. On April 6th, Napoleon was compelled to abdicate and was exiled to the island of Elba in the Mediterranean. The First French Empire came to an end, the Bourbon Restoration took place, and Louis XVIII returned to Paris to reclaim the throne. However, Napoleon did not give up. He never abandoned his dream of hegemony and remained ever vigilant, waiting for the opportunity to stage a comeback. In March 1815, seizing the opportunity while the nations of the anti-French coalition were embroiled in internal disputes during their Congress in Vienna, Napoleon escaped from the Isle of Elba with a small band of loyalists and landed on the French mainland. The French people, long dissatisfied with the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy, flocked to answer Napoleon's call and joined his ranks. Napoleon's forces expanded rapidly. He quickly assembled an army of nearly 200,000 men, recaptured Paris, overthrew the Bourbon dynasty, ascended the throne once again, and established the 100 Days regime. Napoleon's return to power sent shockwaves across Europe. The nations of the anti-French coalition immediately ceased their bickering, rapidly mobilized their forces, and formed the Seventh Coalition. With a combined strength exceeding 700,000 troops, the coalition forces launched a two-pronged offensive against France, aiming to utterly destroy Napoleon and eliminate the threat once and for all. Napoleon knew full well that his time was running out. He realized that to preserve his throne, he had to launch a preemptive strike and defeat the coalition's main force before their full mobilization was complete. Consequently, he led the French army in a proactive offensive against the coalition forces stationed in Belgium, and thus, the Battle of Waterloo erupted. The decisive Battle of Waterloo, June 18, 1815, the ultimate curtain call for hegemony. On June 18, 1815, Napoleon led the French army into a decisive showdown against the British forces commanded by the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian forces commanded by Blücher, near Waterloo in Belgium. Early that morning, the French army launched the initial assault on the British positions. Napoleon sought to utilize the overwhelming power of his artillery to shatter the British defensive lines, intending to follow up with cavalry and infantry charges to completely rout the enemy. Relying on their fortified positions, the British forces mounted a tenacious resistance. A fierce, seesaw battle ensued, resulting in heavy casualties on both sides. In the early stages of the battle, the French forces held a distinct advantage, repeatedly breaching the British forward lines and placing the British in a perilous situation. However, the Duke of Wellington maintained his composure while commanding. He steadfastly held his ground, continuously deploying reserves to plug gaps in the defensive line while awaiting reinforcements from the Prussian army. Napoleon fully understood that the arrival of Prussian reinforcements was the decisive factor in the battle's outcome. Consequently, he dispatched troops on multiple occasions in an attempt to prevent the Prussians from linking up with the British, but each attempt was repelled by the Prussians. In the afternoon, the main body of the Prussian army, led by Blücher, arrived on the battlefield and immediately launched a fierce assault on the French right flank. The French right wing quickly crumbled, forcing Napoleon to divert his reserves to reinforce the flank in an attempt to stem the Prussian offensive. However, seizing this opportunity, the British forces launched a counterattack of their own. Caught in a dire predicament, attacked from both front and rear, the French soldiers suffered a collapse in morale. They began to retreat in disarray, no longer able to mount any effective resistance. Napoleon attempted to personally lead a charge with the Imperial Guard cavalry to salvage the situation, but his efforts ultimately failed, and the Guard cavalry was all but annihilated. By dusk, the French army had completely disintegrated. Soldiers cast aside their weapons and fled in panic. Napoleon was forced to withdraw from the battlefield, and the Battle of Waterloo ended in a crushing defeat for the French. This battle brought a definitive end to Napoleon's dreams of hegemony, as well as to his political career. Following his defeat, Napoleon returned to Paris and, on June 22, abdicated for the second time. He hoped to cede the throne to his son, Napoleon II, but this succession was not recognized by the anti-French coalition. At one point, he planned to go into exile in the United States. However, the Royal Navy's blockade of French ports compelled him to surrender to the British on July 15, whereupon he was taken aboard the British warship Bellerophon. Fearing that Napoleon might once again stage a comeback, the anti-French coalition, particularly Great Britain, decided to permanently exile him to the remote South Atlantic island of St. Helena. The island was characterized by its harsh climate, extreme isolation, and heavy military security. In October 1815, Napoleon arrived on St. Helena, where he resided at Longwood House, provided by the East India Company, alongside a small group of loyal followers, such as the Count of Montholon and the Count of Las Cases. His life was subjected to strict surveillance by the British governor, Hudson Lowe. His movements were restricted, and his correspondence was censored. Napoleon devoted a significant amount of time to dictating his memoirs, gardening, reading, and conversing with his retinue. Through his writing, he sought to shape his own historical legacy, memoirs that would go on to influence the enduring Napoleonic legend. However, the island's damp climate, The austere living conditions and the prolonged psychological distress led to a gradual decline in his health. Beginning in 1819, he suffered repeated bouts of abdominal pain, fatigue, and other symptoms, raising suspicions of stomach cancer or gastric ulcers, a disease from which his father had also died. From March 1821 onward, Napoleon's condition deteriorated rapidly. In his final moments, he uttered his famous last words, "France, the army, head of the army." On May 5, 1821, Napoleon passed away at Longwood House at the age of 51. An autopsy conducted by British physicians revealed ulcerative lesions in his stomach consistent with the characteristics of stomach cancer. His remains were interred in the Geranium Valley on St. Helena. His tombstone bore no name, marked simply with the single word, Napoleon. In 1840, fulfilling Napoleon's dying wish, King Louis-Philippe of France's July monarchy dispatched his son, the Prince of Joinville, to retrieve the remains and bring them back to France. Following a grand ceremonial procession, Napoleon's coffin was laid to rest at Les Invalides in Paris, where it remains on display within the Dôme des Invalides to this day, standing as a pivotal symbol of French history. Historically, there has been some controversy regarding the exact cause of Napoleon's death. His personal physician, Francesco Annamarchi, proved unable to effectively alleviate his suffering. Research conducted in the 20th century advanced the arsenic poisoning theory, citing, for instance, hair samples that tested positive for high levels of arsenic. However, most scholars now believe that such traces likely originated from preservatives or environmental contaminants present at the time. Based on a combination of the autopsy report and family medical history, gastric cancer remains the prevailing conclusion. Let us now turn to the historical echoes of Napoleon, specifically the legacy and insights derived from his era of ascendancy. Although remarkably brief, this zenith of his career profoundly altered the trajectory of history in Europe and across the globe, leaving behind an indelible historical legacy, as well as a wealth of enduring insights and subjects for reflection for future generations. In the military sphere, Napoleon's art of command reached the pinnacle of its time. He revolutionized military tactics, emphasizing the concentration of force, rapid maneuverability, and flanking maneuvers. Adept at seizing the initiative on the battlefield, he frequently achieved victory against superior numbers and stronger adversaries, creating a series of classic case studies such as the battles of Austerlitz and Jena. These tactics were subsequently revered as classics by military strategists and profoundly influenced the development of modern warfare. The Grande Armée he forged, a highly disciplined and formidable fighting force, became the archetype for modern armies, while the cadre of exceptional generals he cultivated went on to become legendary figures in European military history. In the realms of politics and law, Napoleon preserved and consolidated the achievements of the French Revolution. The Napoleonic Code he promulgated stands as modern Europe's first bourgeois civil code. It established fundamental principles such as equality before the law and the inviolability of private property, curtailed the privileges of the clergy and nobility, and disseminated the revolutionary ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. This code not only reshaped France's legal framework, but was also adopted and adapted by nations across Europe and indeed the world, serving as the bedrock of modern legal systems and driving the advancement of bourgeois democratic rule of law. Regarding the geopolitical landscape of Europe, Napoleon's hegemonic rule utterly dismantled the monarchical absolutism and the Westphalian system that characterized the Old Europe. He fundamentally redrew the political map of the continent. The establishment of satellite states, such as the Confederation of the Rhine and the Kingdom of Westphalia, disrupted the existing balance of power among European nations and simultaneously catalyzed the awakening of European nationalism. Although Napoleon ultimately met with defeat and the old European order was partially restored, the revolutionary ideals and nationalist consciousness he had disseminated had already taken deep root in the public psyche. These concepts laid the groundwork for subsequent bourgeois revolutions and national liberation movements across Europe, thereby accelerating the continent's transition into the modern era. At the same time, Napoleon's life has left profound lessons for posterity. Relying on his extraordinary talents, he rose step by step from an ordinary Corsican youth to the pinnacle of power, dominating the European continent and forging a legend. Yet, his hegemonic ambitions and ceaseless expansion ultimately led to his downfall. Years of perpetual warfare drained France's national strength, claimed countless lives, and ignited fierce resistance among the peoples of the conquered territories. Furthermore, the arrogance and obstinacy that characterized his later years, his refusal to heed dissenting opinions, led to disastrous decisions, such as the invasion of Russia, which accelerated his decline. Napoleon's zenith was a tapestry woven from glory and solitude, a symbiosis of brilliance and regret. He was both the heir to the revolution and the pursuer of hegemony, a military genius, yet also a man of boundless ambition. He propelled the march of history forward, even as he inflicted the scourge of war upon the world. Today, centuries later, the legend of Napoleon remains a subject of avid discussion. His military strategies and political acumen continue to be studied and emulated by subsequent generations. Yet, his ultimate failure serves as a perpetual warning to the world. Power and ambition are a double-edged sword. Only by revering life, and by respecting the sovereignty of nations and the will of their peoples, can true and lasting peace be achieved, and only then can one truly earn an enduring place in the annals of history. Looking back upon this turbulent and magnificent era, Napoleon's zenith stands not merely as the legend of a single man, but as a microcosm of an entire age. It bore witness to the surging tide of bourgeois revolution, the intricate interplay of power and ambition, the awakening of national consciousness, and the ceaseless cycles of historical change and progress. This history has long since been etched into the river of time, becoming a classic touchstone for countless generations to reflect upon and contemplate. And the name Napoleon shall forever remain inextricably linked to this legendary era, forever remembered by the world as that of a controversial, legendary emperor who profoundly shaped the course of history. A truly great figure. Dear viewers, thank you for tuning in. I am your time navigator, Lawrence, and together we explore the truths of history. By reflecting on the lives of others, we gain insight into our own strengths and weaknesses. By studying history, we understand the cycles of rise and fall. I hope today's presentation has offered you a fresh perspective on the life of Napoleon. Let us strive together for the advancement of global civilization and peace. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and share it with fellow history enthusiasts.